So with like pharma, how did changes take place back then?
So we got rid of the collaborative agreement pretty quickly because I think people realized it didn't make a lot of sense. There was a lot of resistance in the medical community, but there was also a lot of strife between the Board of Medicine, the Board of Pharmacy, and the Board of Nursing amongst themselves. And nurse practitioners were looked at almost as like the illegitimate stepchild of the Board of Nursing and the New Hampshire Nurses Association, quite frankly. So we felt very vulnerable. We knew that what we were doing really wasn't legal. We were phoning in prescriptions using our physician's, at that point, everybody's employer's name. Then if somebody had a question on the prescription, it was confusing for clients, it was confusing for pharmacists, it was confusing for us. We knew it was not a good situation. So we, as an organization, hired a lobbyist. We learned how to talk with legislators, what the legislative process was in the state of New Hampshire. We got activated and put in a bill. And I think that initially it went through as easily, if I can use that word, as it did, because nobody took us seriously. Certainly the Board of Medicine did not take us seriously. And so because nobody thought that we would be able to get this through or do it, there wasn't as much opposition at the hearings as was expected. So we did get it through, but then we had to promulgate the rules and regulations, and the Board of Pharmacy and the Board of Medicine were both involved, is where we ran into a lot of difficulties. We had a formulary initially that was inclusionary, which meant everything on the list you could prescribe from. If it wasn't on the list, you couldn't. And that was a really big problem because new drugs were coming on the market constantly, and it took so long to go through the formulary process that it was impeding care, especially when we needed to renew meds, and it was very confusing. Then we went to an exclusionary formulary, which meant you could prescribe everything except what was on the formulary, but it was very capricious. It was based on somebody's opinion, and there were all kinds of fights and battles, and I don't know how many hearings and meetings and phone calls, hours and hours of work that a small core group went through, and we were able to, over time, whittle that list down and down and down until we were able to get rid of it completely and we're a full practice authority state. And that was amazing.
Yeah, I sort of came in on the tail end of that. I remember when I first started the exclusionary formulary in the Joint Health Council meetings, and
But what people don't know too is those of us that had our head above the water, they came after me. The Board of Pharmacy filed a complaint against me with the Board of Nursing. When they went to the Board of Nursing, originally they had a file box, like a recipe file box with index cards, with all the nurse practitioners in the state listed on it. Then they had the file cabinet with our applications. So they went to the file box and said that my information was not current and were trying to have disciplinary action taken against me, when I had copies of everything, and when they went to the file cabinet, everything was there. So my lawyer went to the Board of Nursing, looked this up, and there's all my information. So then the Board of Pharmacy came after the Board of Nursing and said they weren't monitoring us well enough, they weren't doing their job well enough. So there was all of this strife. I even had the Board of Pharmacy show up at my door unexpectedly, unannounced, and wanted to do a site inspection. And I called my lawyer immediately when my secretary said the Board of Pharmacy was here to inspect me. And he said, is there one or two of them there? And I said, there's one. He said, okay, let him in. But if they were two, not to let him in. So I said, okay. I was a nervous wreck. He came in and he inspected my office. He looked at where I kept samples. He looked at all my setup. And at the end, he seemed very frustrated. He sat down at a table, similar to the way we are, and my desk was here. And he says, where do you keep your prescription pads? And I said, right here in my drawer on my desk. He says, aha. He literally said, aha, like he had me. And he said, you have to keep your prescription pads in a locked drawer. And I said, come here. And I walked him around. I said, there's the lock on the drawer. It is a locked drawer. And he didn't say another word to me, and he left. So that was the kind of pressure that we were under. And the Board of Medicine was putting a ton of pressure on the Board of Pharmacy. So it was difficult at best, those times.